On a stormy night in 1842, Eleanor Whitmore sat in the attic of Ashwood Manor in Savannah, Georgia, clutching a worn leather ledger. Her husband, Charles Whitmore, a respected planter with ambitions far greater than his wealth, had commanded her to document observations. The first woman brought to that room was Sarah, young, terrified, and silent. Eleanor's pen trembled as she wrote. She understood at once. This was not ordinary cruelty. Charles was beginning an experiment, one that would stretch into horror. The rain had been falling since dusk, a steady curtain against the windows of Ashwood Manor, turning the gardens into dark pools and the long driveway into a river of red mud. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the drafty attic, the highest and coldest room in the house, where the beams groaned with the storm's weight and the smell of dust, cedar, and moth-eaten cloth clung to everything. A single lamp burned on the desk before her, its flame flickering when the wind found the cracks in the shutters. She had a quill in her hand and a leather-bound ledger open to a blank page. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely make the nib touch the paper. Across from her, Charles stood in the shadows, his figure tall and rigid, his pale eyes reflecting lamplight like steel. He had told her in the same calm tone he used when ordering servants or settling accounts that she was to sit in that chair, open the ledger, and write down everything she saw. No embellishments, no questions, only the facts. She had asked once, in a whisper, what exactly she was meant to observe. His jaw had tightened, but he said nothing more until a knock sounded from the stairwell, and the door opened. Two men entered, pushing a woman before them. She was young, perhaps 20, strong in build, her wrists bound with twine. The whites of her eyes gleamed wide with terror, but her lips pressed together as though she had long ago learned the futility of crying out. Her name, Charles said, was Sarah. Eleanor had seen her before in the fields, tall among the rows of cotton, always working silently. Now she was dragged into this room as if she were an object rather than a person. Charles dismissed the men, then turned to his wife. His voice remained calm, instructive, as though this were no different than recording household expenses. Write her name, her age, her condition. Eleanor's throat was so tight she thought she might suffocate, but she obeyed. Her hand scratched the first lines across the page. Sarah, aged about 20. Condition, strong, healthy. Charles moved behind the woman, circling her like a farmer might study a horse he was considering purchasing. He spoke in measured tones about height, build, the width of her shoulders, the clarity of her eyes. Eleanor recorded it all. The quill trembled in her fingers, blotting ink that spread like bruises across the page. The storm outside masked the silence in the room, but Eleanor heard every breath, every shuffle of Sarah's bare feet on the boards. At last Charles turned to his wife and told her to continue writing, for what came next must also be documented. Eleanor's mind tried to recoil, to slip into some corner where she could not see what her eyes beheld, but Charles's voice anchored her to the task. She gripped the quill until her knuckles whitened and wrote every word, every number, every phrase he dictated, even as her stomach twisted and her heart pounded with shame. Sarah did not cry out. That, Eleanor would later think, was the most terrible part, the silence of a woman so accustomed to suffering that she no longer expected her pain to matter. The night dragged on, the lamp burning low, the rain lashing harder against the house. When it was finished, Charles closed the ledger, inspected her writing with a cold glance, and told her this was only the beginning. She would serve as witness and recorder for all that was to come. He left her in the attic, the door locked behind him, and the sound of the key turning echoed in her chest like a death knell. She sat alone with the smell of sweat and lamp oil, staring at the words she had written, words that felt like a betrayal not only of Sarah, but of herself. She whispered a prayer, though she could not have said to whom, and wondered how many more nights like this lay ahead. The following morning, Ashwood Manor seemed almost normal. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with damp earth and pine. Charles read the Savannah newspapers in the dining room while Eleanor poured his coffee with hands that still trembled. He spoke of politics, of crop yields, of shipping rates, as if nothing unholy had occurred the night before. Eleanor watched him over the rim of her cup and thought how ordinary he looked, with his neat side, parted hair and pressed waistcoat, the appearance of a man any neighbor would call respectable. Only she knew what lay beneath. Only she had seen the ledger, already filling with words that could never be spoken aloud. She considered burning the pages, but she knew he would make her rewrite them, and perhaps in some hidden place inside herself she wanted the record preserved, not for him, but for the truth. The truth of Sarah's silence, the truth of what her husband had become. She tucked the ledger into its locked drawer when he gave it back to her, the iron key cold against her palm. All day she moved through the house with a stiffness that made the servants exchange glances. She could not bring herself to look directly at Sarah when their paths crossed, the young woman's eyes empty, her body moving with a weariness deeper than exhaustion. Eleanor longed to speak, to apologize, to offer even a crumb of comfort, but the words froze in her throat. She feared Charles's eyes upon her even when he was not in the room. That night, alone in her chamber, she opened her diary, not the ledger, but the small book her mother had given her when she married. She wrote there in a hand different from the one Charles demanded, her words spilling out raw and trembling. She confessed her horror, her complicity, her uncertainty of how to endure. She pressed her face to the page, smearing tears into the ink, and promised herself that if she could not yet stop him, she would at least bear witness in her own way, for what had begun in that attic was not finished. Charles had plans, vast and methodical, and he would need her as his instrument. She prayed she would find the strength to survive it, or else the courage to end it before it consumed them all. That summer, a visitor arrived. Dr. Silas Redfern, a physician with dubious credentials, spoke of hereditary science and selective breeding. He measured skulls, catalogued hair and skin, and treated human children as livestock. Eleanor, forced to assist, recorded the details in his books. But whispers spread in the quarters, babies disappearing in the night, women collapsing into grief. Eleanor discovered Charles was not alone. Neighbors, men of influence in Charleston and Savannah, were involved. The summer air clung heavy to Ashwood Manor, thick with the scent of magnolia and the hum of cicadas. By June of 1842, the fields outside Savannah shimmered in relentless heat, the rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon like an endless punishment. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the days in a kind of waking trance. She performed her duties as mistress of the house, directed the household servants, and greeted neighbors with polite composure, but beneath her calm exterior lay the memory of that storm-racked night in the attic. The ledger remained locked in Charles's desk, but she felt its weight in every room. She could not enter the east wing without hearing Sarah's silence, without imagining the scratch of her own quill recording atrocities. Charles had spoken little of it since, only remarking that her notes were precise and that he valued her diligence. She learned quickly that silence was her only defense. In July, a carriage arrived up the long dirt drive, its wheels throwing red dust into the heavy air. Eleanor stood on the gallery, shading her eyes against the glare, and saw a man descend with deliberate care. He was stout, his face framed by thick mutton chop whiskers, his hands pale and soft as if they had never worked. Charles greeted him with unusual warmth, his voice carrying an edge of anticipation Eleanor had rarely heard. The visitor introduced himself as Dr. Silas Redfern of Charleston. His speech was smooth, practiced, the sort of tone that suggested he was accustomed to holding forth in lecture halls or parlors where no one dared interrupt. Charles ushered him into the house, and from that moment the atmosphere of Ashwood shifted. Dr. Redfern spoke often at dinner, filling the silence with long discourses on hereditary science and what he termed the laws of natural selection. He spoke of bloodlines as though they were ledgers to be balanced, of human beings as though they were cattle to be improved. Elinor sat stiffly in her chair, the silver fork heavy in her hand, as he explained how careful breeding could elevate or degrade a race, how measurements of skull and proportion of limbs revealed destiny. Charles listened with rapt attention, nodding, questioning, taking notes on loose sheets that would later join the growing pile in his study. When Elinor's gaze met the doctor's, she felt a chill despite the suffocating heat. His eyes did not see her as a person, but as a specimen, part of a category, an object of study. Within days, Redfern began his examinations. Elinor was ordered to assist, for Charles insisted her handwriting and precision were essential. She followed the doctor through the quarters where the enslaved families lived, forced to hold his brass calipers as he measured skulls, to record the angle of a nose, the breadth of shoulders, the shape of hands. The people stood silent, their faces hard masks, as if they knew protest would bring only worse suffering. Redfern touched their children with clinical detachment, prying open mouths to inspect teeth, pressing fingers against bones to gauge growth. He murmured observations while Elinor wrote them into columns: stature, temperament, intelligence. The words bled together on the page, transforming human lives into figures, lives into categories. When Redfern finished his rounds each day, he retired with Charles to the study, where the two men pored over books and journals by lamplight, their low voices carried through the walls, the words drifting like poisonous smoke: selection, value, stock, breeding potential. Elinor sat in her chamber with her hands clenched, the sounds weaving into her dreams until she could no longer separate waking from nightmare. It was Naomi, the housemaid, who dared to whisper the truth one humid morning as she scrubbed the floors of the gallery. She glanced around to be sure no one watched, then leaned close to Elinor. "They've taken children before, ma'am," she said, her voice thin as thread. "Babies gone in the night. Mothers told they'd been sold, but no one ever sees them again." Elinor froze, the rag limp in her hands. She wanted to ask how many, when, where, but fear locked her throat. Naomi straightened quickly, her eyes darting to the doorway. The words were left hanging like smoke that would never clear. That evening, Elinor tried to study Charles's face as he and Redfern drank brandy in the parlor. Charles looked younger, almost enlivened, as though the doctor's theories had given shape to something already alive within him. His eyes glowed with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself chosen by science, justified in his cruelty. Elinor realized then that what had begun with Sarah was not an isolated act, but the foundation of a larger scheme. Charles's ledger was only the first volume of what Redfern intended to become a library. Weeks passed, the examinations continued, Elinor's nightmares deepened. One night she followed the glow of lamplight down the hall and paused outside the study door. Through the woods she heard Redfern's measured voice describing a network of planters across Georgia and the Carolinas, men eager to apply scientific methods to their resources. He spoke of ships departing Savannah Harbor bound for Havana, where buyers paid fortunes for children of mixed blood who could pass as white. Charles's laugh, low and pleased, joined his. Elinor pressed her back to the wall and felt the house tilt around her. She understood then that the walls of Ashwood did not contain this horror. It reached far beyond, into parlors and ports, into the very arteries of the South. The doctor remained for 3 weeks. By the time his carriage rattled back toward Charleston, Ashwood was altered forever. Charles carried new books beneath his arm, new instruments in polished cases, and a new resolve in his cold gray eyes. Elinor watched from the gallery, her hand gripping the railing, and knew with dreadful certainty that the summer had marked the true beginning. Sarah's silence was only the first echo of a chorus that would swell in secret, written in ledgers, hidden in drawers, whispered in parlors, and she, trapped in the gilded cage of her marriage, was bound to write every word. One night, a servant named Naomi approached Elinor. In whispers, she revealed the existence of a boy hidden on the edge of the property. His name was Thomas, just 9 years old, pale-skinned with eyes like Charles's. He had been kept apart, educated secretly, trained as proof of Charles's theories. Elinor demanded to see him. When she did, she saw a boy who looked more like a son than property. Thomas understood his fate and swore he would not become the weapon his father intended. The air hung heavy with late August heat, the kind that pressed against the skin like a damp cloth and made every step sluggish. Ashwood Manor seemed quieter than usual, though Elinor suspected the silence was not peace but fear. The enslaved women worked with downcast eyes, the children lingered close to their mothers, and the men kept to themselves, shoulders tight, voices low. Something unspoken weighted the grounds, as though all of them shared a secret that Elinor had not yet been allowed to see. It was Naomi who finally broke that silence. She came to Elinor one morning in the laundry house, her hands dripping soapy water, her face pale with tension. She did not meet Elinor's eyes, but her voice was urgent. "There is a boy, ma'am," she whispered, barely louder than the rustle of cloth, "lives apart near the East Woods. You should know of him." Elinor's heart jolted. "What boy?" Naomi's gaze darted toward the open door, and she lowered her voice still further. "Master's boy, been here near 10 years, pale like him, eyes like him, kept away from the rest." Her words struck Elinor like a blow. She asked nothing more then, for fear of being overheard, but the image seared itself into her mind, a hidden child, a secret life carefully nurtured in the shadows. That evening she confronted Charles in the dining room, her voice steady, though her hands trembled beneath the table. She asked casually if there was a child at Ashwood who received lessons apart from the others. His fork paused midway to his mouth, and his gray eyes locked onto hers with sudden sharpness. "Where did you hear that?" His tone was quiet, but the danger in it was unmistakable. Elinor forced herself to smile faintly. "Servants talk. I pay attention." The silence stretched so long she thought he might strike her, but at last he set down his fork with deliberate calm. "Yes," he said. "His name is Thomas. He is important. You will see him if you insist, but you will not speak to him unless I permit it. You will observe only." The following afternoon Charles led her beyond the barn, along a narrow path that curved into the East Woods. The cicadas sang overhead, and the scent of pine thickened as they walked. At last they came upon a cabin unlike the others, sturdier, with glass panes in the windows and a porch with real steps. Charles unlocked the door and ushered her inside. The room was spare but not harsh. Bookshelves lined with volumes from Charles's own library, a narrow bed, a table with papers neatly stacked. At a small desk near the window sat a boy of about 9. His hair was light brown, his skin pale enough that in different clothes he might have passed unnoticed in white society. He looked up as they entered, and Elinor's breath caught. The resemblance was unmistakable. The angular jaw, the set of the mouth, and most of all the gray eyes, Charles's eyes, stared back at her from a face too young to bear their weight. "Thomas," Charles said, and there was a note in his voice Elinor had never heard before, something perilously close to pride. "This is Mrs. Whitmore." The boy rose with a smoothness beyond his years and bowed formally. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore." His diction was precise, his tone steady, the product of careful instruction. Elinor forced a polite smile, though her chest felt hollow. She wanted to ask him questions, to know what he understood about his place in this house, but Charles's presence was a chain around her throat. For the next half hour, Charles displayed the boy as though he were a prized stallion. Thomas read passages from books well beyond his age, worked through arithmetic problems with ease, recited names of cities and rivers with flawless memory. His face remained a mask, revealing nothing, even when Charles's hand rested heavy on his shoulder. Elinor watched every detail, the careful posture, the measured responses, the way the boy's eyes flicked once toward her with something that looked like defiance before sliding back into blank composure. When at last they left the cabin, Elinor's legs felt weak. Charles's voice carried a quiet satisfaction. "You see, he is proof that the theories are sound. With proper breeding and education, we may produce children who surpass their origins. In another decade, Thomas will be ready for the next phase." Elinor's heart lurched. "What phase?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. Charles's gaze was fixed on the path ahead. He will father children of his own, carefully selected pairings, chosen for the most promising traits. His children will be the culmination of everything we have learned. Elinor stopped walking, the words pressed against her chest like iron. "You are planning to use your own son as breeding stock." Charles turned, his expression hardening. "He is not my son in any legal sense. He is property, exceptional property, yes, but property nonetheless, and he will serve the purpose for which he was created. Do not allow yourself to become sentimental. Sentiment has no place in science." That night, Elinor sat alone in her chamber, her hidden diary open before her, but the words refused to come. Her hand hovered over the page, useless, as though language itself could not contain what she had seen. Thomas was not merely a child. He was a living symbol of everything Charles and Redfern desired to build, the cornerstone of a system designed to perpetuate itself across generations. She imagined the boy forced to repeat the violations she had already witnessed, to inflict on others what had been inflicted on his mother, to bring forth children who would be trapped in the same cycle. It was a legacy of horror crafted not by accident but by design, and Charles intended it to continue long after he was gone. When Elinor finally laid her pen to paper, her handwriting was jagged, her words desperate. She recorded Thomas's name, his age, his appearance, every word Charles had spoken. She wrote of the pride in his voice, the blankness in the boy's face, the defiance that flickered for only a heartbeat. She ended with a vow she barely dared to whisper even to herself, that she would find some way to stop it. Days turned into weeks. Charles visited the cabin often, teaching Thomas to read Greek, to calculate compound interest, to debate history and philosophy. Elinor found excuses to accompany him, telling herself she was only fulfilling her role as observer, but in truth she sought the boy's eyes, the fleeting connection that told her he understood more than Charles believed. One evening, as Charles stepped outside to fetch a book from the porch, Thomas looked at her quickly. His lips barely moved, but the words reached her like a thunderclap. "I know what he wants of me. I will not be what he made." Before she could respond, Charles returned, and the boy's face smoothed into its practiced mask. That night, Elinor lay awake, listening to the chirr of crickets outside her window. She thought of Sarah's silence, of Naomi's whispered warning, of the children who had already disappeared into the night. She thought of Thomas, forced into a role he had never chosen, carrying the burden of a father who denied him even the dignity of being called son. She pressed her face into her pillow and stifled her sobs. For the first time since the attic ledger, she felt not only horror but a spark of something else, hope, fragile and dangerous, embodied in the steady gray eyes of a boy who refused to be broken. Elinor's suspicions widened when she visited the Caldwells, neighbors who entertained Charles with late-night meetings. She overheard fragments of conversations, shipments leaving Savannah Harbor, buyers in Havana, coded ledgers with children's names marked as assets. She realized this was no isolated cruelty. It was a network. Families, neighbors, and powerful men across counties were trading in lives. The autumn of 1008, 142 brought little relief from the oppressive heat. The air turned dry, the leaves brittle, the fields dulled to shades of rust and brown, yet the weight of the season pressed down just as heavily as the summer had. Elinor moved through Ashwood with the careful grace of a woman who knew she was being watched. Charles had grown more restless since Dr. Redfern's departure, pacing the study late into the night, sending letters sealed with his heavy wax stamp, receiving parcels of books and instruments from Charleston. He no longer asked questions. To ask was to invite suspicion, and suspicion from Charles carried consequences she dared not imagine. Still, she observed silently, recording when she could, and storing away impressions in the diary that lay hidden at the bottom of her sewing basket. One evening, Charles announced they had been invited to dine with the Caldwells, neighbors whose land adjoined theirs to the west. Elinor had met the Caldwells only once, at church, and found them polite but distant. Now Charles spoke of them with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, remarking on their good judgment, their fine library, their shared commitment to improvement. Elinor knew that word well enough by now. Improvement meant charts and measurements, theories and ledgers. Improvement meant cruelty wrapped in silk. She said nothing, but she felt a chill creep along her skin as she laid out her best dress for the evening. The Caldwell house stood larger than Ashwood, with tall columns glowing pale in the moonlight and windows blazing with candlelight. The parlor was thick with cigar smoke when they entered, the air rich with the scent of brandy. Mr. Caldwell was broad-shouldered, his hair thinning, his laugh booming, while his wife moved gracefully among the guests, her smile as polished as the silver on the sideboard. Around the room, Elinor recognized other faces, men from Savannah, from nearby plantations, from families whose names carried weight in the county courthouse. She realized at once that this was no ordinary dinner. It was a gathering. Conversation ebbed and flowed in genteel tones, but Elinor listened closely, catching fragments that slipped like knives through the pleasantries. A man spoke of shipments delayed at Savannah Harbor, his voice low but edged with irritation. Another answered with assurance that Havana buyers remained eager, that prices had risen for children of the right complexion. Elinor's fingers tightened around her glass, though her expression never faltered. She let the words wash over her, recording them silently in her mind. Later, as the men retired to the study, the women lingered in the parlor, their talk drifting to fabrics and children, illnesses and remedies. Mrs. Caldwell leaned close to Elinor, her voice soft enough to be mistaken for confidence. "You are fortunate, my dear, to be married to a man of such foresight. Charles sees the future clearly. Many resist change, but progress requires courage." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes gleamed with something sharper than kindness. Elinor murmured agreement, though bile rose in her throat. She wanted to scream that progress built on stolen children and broken women was nothing but rot, but she forced her lips into a polite curve and sipped her wine. When Charles emerged with the other men, his face was flushed with satisfaction. The study doors had been shut, but Elinor had drifted near enough earlier to catch muffled words through the thick wood, pairings, traits, exchange. She imagined ledgers spread across the table, names reduced to columns of figures, futures sealed in ink. She felt the house closing in around her, the polite laughter of neighbors masking a conspiracy that stretched beyond Ashwood's gates. On the carriage ride home, Charles spoke with unusual animation. He described plans for correspondence with men in Charleston and even further afield, connections that would allow them to share observations, to trade stock selectively, to refine methods. His words spilled out, sharp and eager, as though he had waited years for allies who understood. Elinor sat rigid beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the black line of trees racing past. Each word branded itself into her memory. She knew she would write them all down as soon as she could, though the thought made her stomach twist. The days that followed were filled with visitors. Men arrived on horseback or in carriages, staying for hours in the study, their hats resting on the hall table, their voices rising and falling in tones too low for her to decipher. Eleanor kept to her chamber during these meetings, but she noted each face, each name, each time the butler carried in decanters of brandy and trays of cigars. At night, Charles grew secretive with his papers, locking drawers, pocketing keys, but Eleanor had already learned to notice without being seen. She memorized what she glimpsed, a list of dates alongside initials, columns labeled with H, S, and C. She did not yet know their meaning, but she would. It was Naomi again who whispered the truth Eleanor already suspected. Late one night, when the household was quiet, the maid slipped into Eleanor's room with fear etched across her face. "Wagons come, ma'am," she murmured. "Come in the dark, when most are asleep. Take babies, say they're sold, but no one knows where. Mothers cry until their voices break. Some near lost their minds. Been happening long before you came, but more now, since the doctor—" Her voice broke then, and she pressed her hands together as though in prayer. "They'll keep doing it unless someone stops them." Eleanor reached for her hand, squeezed it tight, though she dared not promise what she could not yet deliver. She saw in Naomi's eyes both fear and trust, and that weight settled on her heart like stone. Weeks passed. Eleanor's awareness of the network grew sharper. She noticed subtle signs, the way Mr. Caldwell and Charles exchanged glances when a neighbor mentioned children, the coded language about cargo and parcels slipped into conversation, the deliberate vagueness when wives asked where certain funds had come from. The women, Eleanor realized, knew more than they admitted. Their silence was complicity, their smiles armor. Some looked away, but others, like Mrs. Caldwell, embraced the cruelty with zeal, framing it as progress, as science, as the future. Eleanor saw then how the web extended beyond the men's ledgers and into the fabric of every family around them. Neighbors were not ignorant, they were participants. The realization left Eleanor sleepless. She paced her chamber at night, her bare feet whispering against the rug, her pulse hammering. The world beyond Ashwood, the polite society of dinners and church pews, was no refuge. It was part of the machine. She felt trapped in a cage that stretched far wider than the plantation, its bars forged of secrecy and power. She began to wonder not whether she could stop Charles, but whether anyone could. And yet she continued to write. In her hidden diary she recorded everything, the names of visitors, the scraps of conversation, the dates wagons came and went. She wrote of the Caldwell's laughter, of Mrs. Caldwell's eyes gleaming with complicity, of Charles's excitement at finding allies. She wrote as though the act itself were resistance, as though preserving the truth might one day matter. She did not know who would read her words or when, but she wrote anyway, because silence was unbearable. The autumn sun dipped earlier each day, leaving the evenings long and dim. The fields emptied, the cotton gins ground late into the night, and Ashwood seemed quieter again, but Eleanor knew the quiet was only surface. Beneath it lay a current pulling stronger, carrying children away from their mothers, binding neighbors together in secrecy, and feeding Charles's growing ambition. She felt it pressing closer, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the shadow of the neighbors fell fully across her own house. In the city, Eleanor sought out Reverend Jonathan Pierce, a young Presbyterian minister recently arrived from the north. Carefully, she unburdened fragments of her knowledge, couching them as spiritual questions. He listened, troubled, and pressed for details. Slowly, Eleanor passed him pieces of her secret diary, copied pages from Charles's ledger. Pierce promised he would take the evidence north, to people who could act, but such secrets never stayed safe for long. The winter of 1,842 settled over Savannah with a sharpness that surprised Eleanor. The nights were colder, the wind cutting through the shutters and rattling the panes of Ashwood Manor. Smoke from the chimneys hung low in the air, curling against the gray sky. The household huddled near the hearths, but Elinor found little warmth. The shadows within the house seemed darker than the ones outside, and her secret diary grew heavier with each page she filled. She had recorded everything: Thomas's lessons, Charles's schemes with the Caldwells, the whispered rumors Naomi shared, the nights when wagons came and left. Yet the pages themselves were powerless. Words written in her hand could do nothing unless someone beyond Ashwood could see them, believe them, act on them. It was at church one Sunday that she first noticed the young minister. Reverend Jonathan Pierce had arrived only weeks before, replacing an aging pastor whose sermons had grown tired and repetitive. Pierce was not yet 30, his voice clear, his manner earnest, and though his sermons avoided controversy, Elinor sensed a restlessness beneath his composure. He spoke of truth, of conscience, of the courage to face wickedness. His words pricked her like needles. She sat stiffly in the pew beside Charles, her gloved hands folded in her lap, but inside her heart pounded with an idea she barely dared name. Perhaps this man, an outsider unentangled in the webs of Savannah's families, might hear her. Days passed before she found an excuse. She told Charles she wished to donate fabric to the poor and would consult the minister about distribution. Charles, pleased at her piety, agreed. So one cold afternoon she rode into the city, her hands hidden beneath her cloak, her eyes scanning the street for anyone who might recognize too much in her face. The church was quiet when she entered, the pews empty, the air scented faintly with wax and pine. Reverend Pierce stood near the pulpit, arranging papers. He looked up as she approached, his expression open, curious. She introduced herself with the practiced grace of a plantation mistress, speaking first of charity, of fabric, of the poor. But as they spoke, her voice trembled, and words slipped from her lips before she could recall them. There are things I have seen, things I cannot tell my husband, wickedness, Reverend, wickedness I cannot bear alone. Pierce stilled, his eyes searching hers. He did not press, but he did not look away. After a moment he said quietly, "The Lord gives us a conscience not to be silenced. If you carry a burden, perhaps I can help." The floodgate trembled within her. She dared not open it fully, but she let slip fragments, never naming Charles directly, never describing in detail, but speaking of cruelty masked as science, of children taken, of neighbors complicit. Pierce listened, his brow furrowing, his hands clasped. When she faltered, he said, "Write it down. Do not let the truth vanish. If you cannot yet speak it, then write it. Words endure when voices are silenced." That night, Elinor copied carefully from her hidden diary. She selected pages that described only what she had observed: measurements, ledgers, the strange cabin where Thomas lived. She left out names but included dates, details, enough to suggest the truth without damning her completely, should the papers be found. She folded them into a small packet and carried it sewn into the lining of her cloak. The next time she went to town, she found Pierce alone again. With trembling hands she gave him the packet, her voice low. "These are copies. If anything happens to me, keep them safe. Promise me." His eyes darkened with concern, but he nodded. "I promise." The weeks that followed were an agony of waiting. Charles grew more suspicious, his temper sharper. He began questioning her absences, asking where she went when she left the house, why she lingered in town. Elinor answered carefully, her voice calm though her pulse raced. She said she visited the poor, the sick, the church. Charles's eyes lingered on her longer than before, as though weighing each syllable. She feared each day that he had discovered her secret, that Pierce had betrayed her, that her own words would be her ruin. But Pierce did not betray her. Instead, he pressed gently for more. In January he found her in the churchyard after service, his voice low enough not to carry. "I believe you, but others will need proof, more than words, more than fragments. If you can gather records, ledgers, letters, then perhaps something can be done. There are men in the north who would act if they saw with their own eyes." Elinor felt both hope and terror at his words. To gather more meant greater risk, yet she thought of Naomi's whispers, of the mothers who cried in the night, of Thomas's defiant gray eyes. She nodded, though her stomach knotted with fear. At Ashwood, she watched more closely than ever. When Charles left his study, she slipped inside, her heart hammering, and copied lines from his ledgers onto scraps she hid in her sewing basket. When neighbors visited, she memorized names and dates, writing them down in code after dark. She knew discovery would mean ruin, perhaps death, but the act of writing felt like survival. Each word was a weapon, each line a small rebellion. One night, while copying by candlelight, she heard footsteps in the hall. The door creaked, and Naomi slipped in, her face pale. "Careful, ma'am," she whispered. "He's restless tonight. Keeps checking the rooms." Elinor snuffed the candle quickly, her hands trembling. Naomi glanced at the papers scattered on the desk, and then at Elinor. Her eyes filled with fear and something else. "Trust. Whatever you're doing," Naomi said softly, "don't stop. It may be the only way." The danger thickened with each passing week. Charles's eyes followed her more closely, and once he asked directly, "You've been writing more, haven't you? I see the ink stains on your fingers. What is it you put in your diary?" Elinor forced a laugh, feigning lightness. "Letters to my mother, household notes, nothing of interest." His stare lingered long, then at last he turned away. She knew then that her time was short. In February she delivered a second packet to Pierce, larger than the first. This one contained fragments of ledgers, coded but clear enough to suggest transactions, children marked as assets. Pierce received it with solemnity. "This will matter," he said. "I will carry it north if I must. There are people who will not turn away." Elinor clutched his hand, desperate. "You must be careful, if anyone suspects." He finished the thought for her. "Then it will cost us both dearly." That night Elinor returned to Ashwood with a strange mixture of dread and fragile hope. She knew the danger had never been greater, but for the first time she felt she was no longer alone. Somewhere beyond the confines of Ashwood, beyond Savannah, beyond Georgia itself, her words were moving like seeds scattered on the wind. Whether they would take root, she could not yet know, but she had written them, and that was something. One October morning, Charles discovered a message Thomas had failed to hide. Enraged, he accused Elinor of betrayal. The punishment he threatened was worse than death, confinement in the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum, where inconvenient wives vanished forever. Before the overseer could fetch the doctor, Elinor made her move. Before the gathered enslaved families, she declared she had documented every atrocity, every child taken, every transaction, and had already sent copies to Reverend Pierce. Charles's pale face betrayed fear for the first time. October settled over Georgia with a restless wind that rattled the shutters and stripped the leaves from the pecan trees. The air carried the scent of smoke from the fields, where stalks had been burned down to stubble, leaving the earth blackened and raw. Inside Ashwood Manor, the mood was no less scorched. Charles had grown sharper, his voice cutting more often, his movements quicker, his suspicion a constant presence. Elinor felt it in every glance, every silence. He had begun watching her more closely, his gray eyes cold and calculating, as though he weighed her against the pages of his ledgers. She kept her diary hidden with increasing care, but even her body betrayed her. The ink stains on her fingers, the smudges beneath her nails, the exhaustion etched into her face from nights spent writing by candlelight. The first sign of real danger came one morning when Thomas left a note on her desk. The boy had taken to slipping her small scraps of paper, carefully written phrases that told her what he endured, what he refused to accept. They were the only unfiltered words he dared give anyone, and Elinor treasured them as proof that the boy still held his own mind against the role Charles pressed upon him. But that morning Charles entered her chamber without knocking. He saw the paper before she could hide it. His hand shot out, and in a moment it was his. His eyes scanned the words, defiant words, words of refusal, and his face darkened like a storm. He turned to her, voice low and lethal. "So, you and the boy conspire against me." Elinor tried to steady her voice. "He is a child, Charles. He writes childish things. You cannot—" But Charles cut her off. Do not lie to me, do not think me blind. You have been poisoning him with softness, with sentiment. You would undo years of work with your foolish sympathy. He stepped closer, and she smelled the bitter tang of brandy on his breath. If you are not loyal, then you are dangerous, and I know how to deal with dangerous wives. The words chilled her more than any threat of violence. She knew what he meant. In whispers, she had heard of women sent away to the asylum in Milledgeville, the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum, their voices dismissed as madness, their names erased from polite society. Charles would not need proof. A husband's word was enough. She saw her future in that moment, locked behind iron bars, her diary burned, her truth silenced forever. That evening Charles summoned the overseer, instructing him to prepare for a journey. Elinor sat rigid as the men spoke in low tones, her mind racing. The asylum. He would send her there before the week's end. She imagined Naomi standing helpless, Thomas forced to continue alone, the servants left with no one to witness, no one to remember. And something in her, something that had endured through every night of horror and silence, snapped. She could not let it happen. The breaking point came not in a scream, but in a calm that felt almost foreign. Elinor waited until Charles gathered the household the next morning. He stood on the gallery, his voice carrying across the yard, the enslaved families assembled before him. He spoke of discipline, of loyalty, of obedience. Elinor stepped forward, her body trembling but her voice clear. "I have written it all," she said. The words hung in the air like thunder. Charles turned sharply, his face pale with fury. "What did you say?" She raised her chin, her heart hammering. "Every cruelty, every child taken, every name traded like livestock. I have written it all, and copies have already been sent. You cannot erase them. If you silence me, the truth will speak without me." A ripple of shock passed through the gathered crowd. The overseer froze, uncertain. Naomi's eyes widened, her lips parting in silent prayer. Thomas, standing at the edge of the group, stared at her with a sudden brightness that nearly broke her heart. Charles's face twisted, but his fury was tainted with something new fear. For the first time she saw it in him, sharp and raw. He stepped forward, his voice a hiss meant only for her, lies, empty threats. Elinor held his gaze. "Then search the church, Charles. Search the minister's hands. You will not find silence. You will find your own ledger staring back at you." The moment stretched, a taut wire ready to snap. Then Charles faltered. His hand, which had risen as if to strike her, dropped back to his side. His eyes darted over the assembled families, their faces no longer blank, but alive with something dangerous, awareness. They had heard her words, they knew there was a record. His authority, once absolute, had cracked. The confrontation ended not in triumph, but in a terrible quiet. Charles dismissed the gathering with a clipped order, retreating into the house like a man suddenly aware of the ground shifting beneath him. Elinor remained standing on the gallery, her knees weak, her pulse still thundering. Naomi caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, a gesture of solidarity. Thomas's gray gaze burned into hers with a spark of pride. She had risked everything, but for that moment she had broken the silence. Inside, the battle continued. Charles grew colder, his suspicion constant. He stopped short of sending her away, but only because he no longer knew where the truth lay. If her words had indeed left Ashwood, then removing her would not erase them. He drank more heavily, his hands shaking as he poured brandy into his glass. She began to slip a few drops of laudanum into his drink at night, not enough to kill, not yet, but enough to dull him, to weaken the fire in his eyes. It was a slow poison, a hidden rebellion, a way of tipping the balance back toward survival. Each night she wrote in her diary, her words steadier now. She wrote of the confrontation, of Charles's faltering, of the faces that had heard her declaration. She wrote of the spark in Thomas's eyes, of the trust in Naomi's. She knew the danger had not passed, that Charles could still destroy her, but something had shifted irrevocably. For the first time, fear belonged not only to her, but to him. And as October deepened into November, Elinor found herself listening differently to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind through the shutters. They no longer felt like harbingers of doom, but like reminders that time itself was moving, that nothing Charles built would endure forever. She whispered into the dark each night, not a prayer this time, but a vow, "You will not bury me. You will not bury the truth." The standoff ended not with freedom, but with stalemate. Charles, weakened by Elinor's quiet poisoning of his nightly brandy, lived on in suspicion and bitterness. The breeding program ceased. The stolen children no longer disappeared into the night. Elinor raised Thomas's hopes in secret and promised Naomi she would not allow her daughter to be taken. Years later, when Charles died, Elinor freed those she could, preserved her ledgers, and sealed them with instructions to be opened a century later. In 1943, a historian uncovered the box in a courthouse basement. Inside lay Elinor's diary, Charles's cold notations, and the names of children traded as though they were goods. The truth of Ashwood surfaced at last, too late for those lost, but enough to stain history with the horror of what neighbors, families, doctors, and parents had conspired to hide. The winter that followed was the longest Elinor could remember. The fields lay dormant, the branches bare, the sky gray for weeks at a time, as though the land itself had fallen into uneasy sleep. Inside Ashwood Manor silence reigned, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the smoke has settled, when the bodies still lie strewn and no one dares to speak of what has been lost. Charles moved through the house like a shadow, his footsteps heavier, his eyes duller, his glass never far from hand. The proud, exacting master had begun to fray. His skin lost its color, his hands trembled when he tried to write, his temper sparked quickly then guttered out just as fast. Elinor knew why. The laudanum she slipped into his brandy each evening did its work slowly, softening him, unraveling him, pulling him inch by inch away from the sharpness that had once defined him. The household sensed the shift. The overseer obeyed his orders, but with less conviction. The enslaved families carried themselves differently, their eyes sharper, their movements less hurried. They had heard Elinor's words that day on the gallery. They had seen Charles falter, and once seen, such a thing could not be unseen. Fear remained, but it was not as absolute as before. Even Naomi walked the halls with a straighter back, though she never spoke of it aloud. Thomas, too, changed. He still endured Charles's lessons, but there was a light behind his gray eyes now, a secret knowledge that his father was no longer invincible. At night he found ways to slip notes to Elinor, short phrases of resolve, scraps of hope. "He is weaker. He cannot last. We will outlive him." Elinor lived in a state of constant tension. She feared discovery still, feared that Charles might awaken one morning with clarity and crush her in reprisal. But she also felt a strength she had not known before. The act of speaking, of declaring the truth before the gathered families, had changed her. She was no longer merely a recorder of horror. She was part of its undoing. Each night she wrote in her diary, not with trembling hands now, but with steady resolve. She wrote of Charles's decline, of the quiet ways the household shifted, of the small freedoms Naomi carved out for herself and her daughter, of Thomas's defiance taking root like a tree in poor soil, but refusing to wither. She wrote not only of cruelty, but of survival, of resistance. By spring, Charles was a ghost of the man he had been. His once proud posture bent, his steps slowed, his voice lost the iron edge that had once chilled her. He still tried to cling to his plans, muttering about breeding, about ledgers, about shipments that never came. But no one listened with the same attentiveness. The neighbors, sensing weakness, withdrew their visits. The Caldwells stopped writing, even Dr. Redfern did not return. Charles had become a liability rather than an ally, Ashwood's grand experiment was collapsing, undone not by outside force but by rot from within. When at last Charles died, one warm evening in June, the smell of honeysuckle thick in the air, Elinor felt no triumph, only a long, weary release. He sat in his study with a glass of brandy, and when she found him, his head was bowed over the ledger as though he had fallen asleep mid-sentence. The lamplight flickered on his gray hair, his pale skin, the stillness that left no doubt. Elinor stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the quiet. She felt neither grief nor joy, only the vast silence of an ending. The days that followed were filled with formalities. Neighbors came to offer condolences, their voices hushed, their eyes curious. The funeral was attended with proper decorum, Charles buried in the Whitmore plot beneath a stone that named him a respected planter and husband. Elinor stood beside the grave, her black veil hiding her face, and thought of all the names never etched in stone. Sarah, the mothers whose children had been taken, the children whose futures had been sold. Their silence pressed upon her more heavily than the minister's words, but in the quiet after the burial, Elinor acted. She freed who she could not openly, not with proclamations, but quietly, carefully. She arranged for Naomi's daughter to be sent north under the pretense of service in a relative's household, a false trail that led instead to safety. She whispered instructions to trusted servants about money hidden in jars buried beneath the magnolia tree, enough to carry them away if they dared to risk flight. She loosened the reins of the household until the chains Charles had fastened grew slack. She could not undo everything, but she could tilt the scales, and she preserved the record. Charles's ledgers remained locked in his desk, untouched, but Elinor gathered her own diaries, page after page of testimony written in her clear hand. She copied the most damning sections, sealed them in a wooden box, and hid it in the county courthouse beneath deeds and contracts. On the lid she wrote only, "To be opened 100 years hence." She knew the risk, that her words might never be found, that dust and decay might swallow them. But she also knew that truth, once written, had a way of surviving. Years passed. Elinor grew older, her hair streaked with gray, her body slower, but her resolve never wavered. She saw Thomas grow into a man, saw the quiet fire in him deepen. He carried himself not as a tool of his father's schemes, but as his own person, scarred yet unbroken. She did not speak of their shared secret often, but sometimes, when their eyes met across a room, she saw in him the same vow she had written in her diary. "We will not let silence win." Ashwood itself began to crumble. The grand columns chipped, the roof leaked, the fields produced less each year. The neighbors whispered of mismanagement, of decline, but Elinor felt only a grim satisfaction. Ashwood's grandeur had been built on cruelty, and now it sank beneath the weight of its own sins. When at last she left the house for the final time, her diary packed in a trunk, she did not look back. A century later, in 1943, a clerk sifting through the courthouse basement uncovered a sealed box. Dust coated the wood, and the iron lock broke with a single tap of a hammer. Inside lay Elinor's diaries, her careful handwriting preserved, the ink faded but legible. Page after page told of Charles Whitmore's experiments, of Dr. Redfern's measurements, of children vanished in the night, of neighbors complicit in silence. The names were there, the dates, the details that stripped away the polite veneer of history. The truth of Ashwood surfaced at last. Historians would argue, scholars would debate, but the words themselves spoke with a clarity no one could deny. They carried the voices of the lost, preserved by a woman who refused to let silence be the final word. And though Elinor's own grave lay weathered and nearly forgotten, her legacy endured, not in stone but in ink. The story of Ashwood, once buried, now stood in the light, a scar upon history that could not be erased. For the first time in a century, the silence was broken.